Cheese mites are among the least visible arthropods you have probably encountered in your daily life. They have been one of the most consequential creatures in the history of European cheesemaking. These arachnids live on the surface of many aged cheeses. Most people who eat cheese have no idea these animals exist, let alone that they are sometimes deliberately cultivated to transform the flavor and appearance of a finished wheel. Cheese mites have shaped traditional cheese production for centuries and triggered international trade disputes in more recent history. The paradox of cheese mites is that they occupy two different roles at once. In most of the global dairy industry, they are treated as vermin, contaminating stored cheese, grain, flour, and dried meats, and can trigger allergic reactions in workers who handle heavily infested products. In a handful of traditional European cheese-making regions, however, the same arthropods are welcomed onto the cheese rinds and considered indispensable to the finished character of an expensive cheese. Cheese mites belong to the order Sarcoptiformes within the Acari. An adult cheese mite is typically less than a millimeter in length. That makes them just barely detectable to an unaided eye when they gather in large numbers, but essentially invisible one at a time. Aiding their undetectability is the fact the mites are pale and often clear. They have likely been on your cheeses without you noticing. The life cycle of a cheese mite is short, and this is one reason infestations can move so quickly from manageable or helpful to catastrophic. Eggs hatch into six-legged larvae, which molt into eight-legged protonymphs, then into deutonymphs, into tridonymphs, and finally into adults. Under favorable conditions, the whole sequence takes only 2 weeks. A single female can lay hundreds of eggs over her lifetime. In a cheese cellar held at a nice temperature, a few mites can produce a dense dust of millions within a month or two. Under stress, some species produce a specialized form called the hypopus. This form travels by clinging to insects, rodents, or human clothing and rides to new food sources. The existence of the hypopus is part of why mite infestations spread so quickly. Once a facility has mites, the animals can move from food to food and hide out through cleanings that would kill active stages. The means by which mites reach cheese in the first place are largely passive. Airborne mite stages can drift into an aging room through doors and vents, or mites can hitchhike on wooden shelves and cloth wrappers brought in from other facilities. Once a single founding population takes hold in the cellar, it can persist for decades. Genetic studies have shown that populations separated by great distances, such as those in traditional French producers and those in Japanese cheese specialty stores, can be identical, showing a long history of incidental transport through the international cheese trade. What cheese mites eat on a cheese surface is less the cheese itself and more the fungi, bacteria, and yeasts that grow on the rind during aging. They do consume fats and proteins from the rind and can bore short distances into it as they feed. Their waste, shed skins, and dead bodies all accumulate on the surface as a fine powder. This dust has its own odor, often described as musty, and it carries many of the compounds that end up in the flavor of the finished cheese. Several different mites are commonly found on or in cheese. The most important species in traditional European context are Tyrolycus casei and Acarus cero, both of which are intentionally used in certain cheese-making techniques. Tyrophagus putrescentii and Tyrophagus longior are also found, but more often as accidental pests. Tyrolycus casei is one of the most commonly associated with intentional cheese ripening in the German tradition. This species is deliberately applied to German cheese Milbenkäse and the traditional goat cheese Altenburg Ziegenkäse, and it is also a common background species in French cheese cellars that produce raw milk mountain cheeses. Acarus cero, the common flour mite, is a broader food pest associated with stored grain, flour, animal feed, and dried meat. This species has been studied mostly for its economic damage, but in 2010, researchers determined that the mites found on the rind of French mimolette are Acaricero rather than Tyrolycus casei, as had been assumed. The discovery that mimolette and milbenkaza use different species came as a surprise to people who had grouped all mite ripening cheeses together. It also helped explain some differences in the flavors of the two cheeses. Acaricero and Tyrolycus casei differ in their metabolic waste products, and the compounds they secrete contribute differently to the finished cheeses. The most famous mite ripened cheese in the world is mimolette, a French product made on the border with Belgium. A young mimolette is smooth and mild, but aged versions develop a dark, deeply pitted rind and a strong flavor. In mimolette production, young cheeses are placed in cool cellars where mites naturally colonize the surface. The wheels are turned regularly and brushed to redistribute the mites. An extra aged mimolette will spend up to 2 years in these cellars, during which time the mites slowly sculpt the rind into its characteristic cratered surface. Before the cheese leaves the facility, producers brush off most of the mites, although some always remain. The role of mites in mimolette is partly aesthetic and partly functional. The pitted rind is considered a defining visual feature of the cheese, but the holes and channels opened by the feeding mites allow air to reach the interior of the cheese, which accelerates various flavor reactions. Waste products produced by the mites also accumulate into the outer layers, changing the flavor. Milbenkäse is a much more regionally specific product made in eastern Germany. The small, fresh cheeses are placed in wooden boxes filled with rye flour, into which live Tyrolycus casei mites are introduced. The mites feed partly on the flour and partly on the surface of the cheese, and their activity slowly transforms the cheese from yellow to brown. The longer the Milbenkäse sits in its box, the darker and more intense it becomes. In Milbenkäse, the mites are eaten along with the cheese. Unlike mimolette, where the mites are mostly removed before sale, Milbenkäse is traditionally served with the living and dead mites still present. This practice has made Milbenkäse export difficult, since regulations in many countries, including the US, prevent the deliberate sale of food containing live arthropods. Altenburg Ziegenkäse is another German cheese with cheese mites. It is a soft goat cheese from the region around the town of Altenburg. Mites are not typically added to the cheese on purpose, but under traditional aging conditions, they often colonize the rind, and some producers regard them as part of the expected cheese ecology. French mountain cheeses frequently host populations of Tyrolycus casei in their aging cellars. Large wheels mature for months or years in cool stone cellars as their rinds are colonized. Producers do not always actively encourage the mites, but they tolerate them as a normal part of traditional ripening. Italian aged cheeses are affected as well. Canestrato often develops Acaricero populations on its rind during long ripening. Pecorino Romano and other hard Italian cheeses can have similar issues, especially in small traditional operations where aging cellars are not strictly sealed. Whether this is a pest problem or a feature of traditional production often depends on the individual producer's opinion. Britain and the United States host their own aged cheeses that attract mites. Cloth-bound cheddars, which are wrapped in cloth and aged for a year or more, commonly develop small mite populations on the cloth and rind. Stilton, particularly well-aged wheels, can show the same thing. American farmhouse cheesemakers producing natural rinded wheels frequently encounter mites in their aging rooms. Most of these producers treat mites as pests to be controlled rather than flavor agents to be cultivated, but where that line sits isn't always clear. Opposing intentional cultivation sits the much larger story of mites as pests. In most commercial cheesemaking, mite infestations represent a serious economic threat. Population that gets out of control in an aging room can ruin production. The rinds of affected wheels become gray, powdery, and covered in mite dust. The cheeses cannot be sold at high prices, and in severe cases, they cannot be sold at all. Mites also contaminate the facility itself, colonizing wooden shelves, cloth wrappers, crevices in the wall, and equipment. Once established, they are extremely difficult to eliminate. A single overlooked mite in a crack in a floorboard can restart an infestation after a thorough cleaning. Putting a number on the economic cost of mites to a global cheese industry is difficult because infestations are often handled quietly. Specific incidents, such as the detention of mimolette shipments at US ports in 2013, can be quantified, but most can't. Losses like spoilage rates in small producers are largely invisible. What is known is that established producers invest significant resources in mite control and consider a persistent infestation a business threatening problem. The regulatory history of cheese mite infestation affecting international trade is dominated by the 2013 US dispute over French mimolette. In 2013, inspectors at the FDA began detaining shipments of French cheese at ports of entry. The agency cited concerns about mite densities. Thousands of pounds of cheese piled up in warehouses while producers protested. The FDA's stated concern was the potential for allergic reactions in sensitive consumers, based on the classification of Acrocero as a recognized allergen. The dispute was resolved quietly by the end of 2014. Mimolette returned to American shelves, with producers taking additional steps to reduce mite numbers before export. Imported mimolette is once again a staple of specialty cheese counters in the US.